I love the PS3. Do not ask how many I own. One of the reasons I love it is that Sony actually encouraged you to swap out the hard drive whenever you felt like. Whether the drive failed or you just wanted more storage, Sony didn't do anything to stop you, unlike another company I know. While SSDs were available when the PS3 was relevant, they were way too expensive to make any sense at the time. Nowadays though, things have changed. You can pick up a 1TB SSD for not too much money. Or, well, you could. And with PS3 modding allowing you to copy your physical library to the console being easier than ever, an SSD upgrade might actually seem worthwhile. There are, however, some limitations to consider with the PS3. If you were planning to put a 4TB drive in your PS3 to store your very legitimate PS3 backup collection, well, you're out of luck. The PS3's operating system tends to get really unhappy when the internal drive size exceeds about 1.5 terabytes. I can't really fault Sony for that one. They probably never imagined that somebody would try to put such a large drive in there, but it does suck if you have a large game collection. Thankfully, you can load games onto a USB drive, but that's a different point of discussion. The second one to consider is the SATA bottleneck. The PS3 only uses a SATA 1 connection, which delivers practically around 150 megabytes a second. Pitiful by today's standards, and even a high-end 2.5-inch hard drive can saturate that bandwidth. With that in mind, it might seem pretty pointless to put an SSD in then. And that's what I want to explore. Can the better access times and low latency of an SSD really make a difference on the PS3? We're going to test 3 different drives on this fat 65nm PS3. The stock 80GB 5400 RPM drive that came with it, a modern 1TB WD Black 7200 RPM drive, which as we'll see in a bit turned out to be quite the oddity, and this random 240GB SSD I have lying around. Ideally, we should have 3 of the same size drive, so that way the OS dealing with the larger storage space doesn't affect performance, but that simply isn't going to be possible while comparing it against the stock original drive. Plus, I don't want to buy anything for this video. This SSD isn't fancy, and that's the point. It makes almost no sense to drop money on a high-end SSD with a DRAM cache when we're dealing with such a bottleneck. So this 240GB Kingston A400 SSD is more representative of what most people would buy to stick in their console. Of course, the console is going to be modded. There shouldn't be too much of a speed difference between a PS3 with full custom firmware and PS3 Hen, but since this PS3 can, we're going with the latest EvilNat 4.92 custom firmware. First, let's do a cold boot up test. This will be timed from pressing the power button to all of the XMB icons fully loading on screen. The stock hard drive booted in a reasonable 19.1 seconds. The 1TB drive was all over the place. The first of many hiccups with these drives. Yes, I said drives, as I ended up testing multiple to see what the problem was, which we'll get to at the end. I saw boot times that ranged between 18.8 and 23.5 seconds. Normally, that is. There were a couple times where the drives had an abysmal 35-second boot, and the system just seemed to hang for an uncomfortably long period of time. Thankfully, the SSD seemed to be having no problems and consistently booted around 16 seconds. Moving on to my brief and very unscientific XMB video test, I copied 10 episodes of the 90s sitcom Home Improvement, which I ripped from DVD, to H.264 480i interlaced video files. I then scrolled the XMB so that the maximum number of video thumbnails could be displayed, then I scrolled off the video tab, and then back onto it to see how quickly the thumbnails could start playing. You may think trying to play this many video streams at once would be too much for the CPU, but remember, we have the cell here. Multi-threading was its main purpose, and as we see, the drive is definitely bottlenecking the system. Granted, not by much, but the SSD does appear to load the videos slightly quicker and more evenly. Both the hard drives take a tad longer to begin playing every video. Now moving on to our game tests. The 2 games we're going to test are Uncharted 2 and Persona 5. Uncharted 2 will be testing just a standard load sequence at the beginning, and Persona 5 was chosen as it has a 4.5GB mandatory install when you first run it. This will give us a good idea of what copying data from the drive directly to itself is like. Uncharted 2 was updated to the latest version and was booted at least once on each drive for it to process data, The system was then restarted and unplugged to make sure any cache was cleared from the drives. This was timed from pressing the game icon on the XMB until the Sony Interactive Entertainment screen appeared. The stock HDD loaded in 29.6 seconds, the WD Black loaded in 35 seconds? Yes, it's still worse than the stock drive. And the SSD did it in a very nice 21.5 seconds. For reference, doing the same load test off the Blu-ray netted a 36-second result, so each drive is at least faster than loading off the disc. And now for Persona 5's install. You might be wondering why the game has to install data if the game is already on the hard drive. Well, the way we're loading the games on here is effectively tricking the PS3 into thinking the game is running off an actual Blu-ray. You might think of it like loading a disk image in an emulator, so as far as the PS3 is concerned, it still needs to install the data. The timing was done from pressing the icon on the XMB until the installing data message disappeared. The stock drive installed in 9 minutes and 44 seconds, the 1TB drive did an astonishingly bad 26 minutes and 47 seconds, and the SSD did it in a nice speedy 5 minutes and 13 seconds. Before we go over the SSD results, we need to talk about this 1TB hard drive, because this absolutely should not be performing this poorly. And just to make sure it wasn't just, this one drive that was bad, I then tried this 1TB Seagate 7200 RPM drive, which is actually originally out of a PS4 Pro, and this one wouldn't even finish formatting. Granted, I think this drive is slightly questionable. The PS3 basically just told me at one point, like, hey man, just give up, this thing ain't gonna work. So I went ahead and I grabbed an identical WD Black 1TB 7200 RPM drive as I had to the first one, and it's the exact same thing. Honestly, the performance is almost identical. Same thing with the weird long boot times randomly. And the second drive actually did significantly worse in Persona 5. The install time took 39 minutes on the second 1TB drive. I have no words for this. This defies logic. Sure, both of these drives are used and they have quite a lot of power on hours, but I tested them when I got them and they passed just fine. There's no concerning smart data on here, so I don't know what's wrong with this. So let's try to narrow it down. Maybe the PS3 just can't cope with a drive as big as 1TB. Now that doesn't sound right to me because, well, I have a 1TB SSD already in my main PS3 Slim. I've had it in there for years and I never noticed any sort of weird performance inconsistencies or just bad performance in general. And so I did all the tests on my PS3 Slim with the 1TB SSD I've had in there for years. Now, of course, this is not a very scientific test. It's a different PS3 and it has a lot more stuff on it than what we were testing here, but still, the performance was nearly the same. About a 21-second boot time, so a little worse than the small SSD, but not anything to be too concerned about. Uncharted loaded about the same, and Persona 5 installed in 5 minutes, 5 seconds. So basically exactly the same performance as the Kingston 240 gig SSD we have here. So clearly it is not a size issue. Of course, I did mention the PS3 does have a size limitation, but it should not be hitting that at only 1TB. I did potentially wonder if maybe these high RPM drives were consuming more power than the stock hard drive, but looking at them, this should actually be consuming less power, if the drive rating is anything to go off of, than the stock drive, so I don't think it could be a power issue. I don't know. I googled around and I saw people on forums actually recommending 7200 RPM drives, back in the day before SSDs were cheap. So what gives? Is it an issue with just the fat PS3? That's the one thing I haven't totally ruled out, but I don't think so. I've never heard of anybody having drive issues on a fat PS3 like this. Maybe the firmware on these drives just really don't like the PS3, or maybe large capacity, high performance hard drives just aren't a good match with the PS3. I don't really know. So if anybody has, 7200 RPM hard drives that are preferably, about 1 terabyte or thereabouts, and you've been running it in your PS3, please tell me what it's been like. I want to believe it's just an issue with my drives or something I did. I don't have any 5400 RPM 1 terabyte drives, unfortunately, to test in here, so I have to leave the testing off there. But as for the SSD, I am very thoroughly impressed. You will for sure notice the difference with an SSD. Like I said, I've already been using an SSD in my PS3 for years, but when I upgraded to an SSD, I didn't actually do proper A/B comparison testing, so I never actually knew what difference you would actually get out of this. But I have to say, it's definitely worth it. It's hard to demonstrate on camera, but just the whole XMB and the system in general just feels snappier, which, I mean, you would expect from an SSD. If you have a 7200 RPM drive already sitting around, then yeah, I'd say it's worth it to throw it in your PS3 and just see what it does. But you should probably just get an SSD if, you can still find one that's affordable at this point.